Good evening and welcome to News of the World. It's Sunday, August 9th. Tonight we drift slowly across 28 countries, from Guinea-Bissau to Nigeria. There's nothing you need to do and nowhere you need to be. Settle in and let the world turn. Guinea-Bissau sits on the West African coast, a small country of mangroves and islands that has long drawn the quiet attention of its neighbors. This week, that attention has come in the form of a delegation from Senegal sent to Bissau just months after ECOWAS, the regional bloc, took steps regarding its ongoing mission there. The details are spare, but the gesture itself speaks to something steady. Senegal, which wraps around Guinea-Bissau on three sides, keeping its lines open, keeping the conversation going. At the same time, Nigeria has rotated the command of its contingent in the ECOWAS mission stationed in Guinea-Bissau. That mission has been a presence in the country for some time now, part of a regional effort to help hold the space for stability after years of political turbulence. A change of command is, in its way, an ordinary thing. Soldiers hand over to soldiers, briefings are passed along, and the work continues. But taken together with Senegal's delegation, you get a sense of a region that has not forgotten this small country, that is still showing up. Guinea-Bissau's story is often told in fragments, through coups and crises, and the wider world tends to look away between them. These days, though, the looking hasn't stopped. Neighbors are still at the door, still talking, still present, and for a country that has known too much silence from the outside, that may be the quieter thing worth holding on to tonight. Croatia's northwestern peninsula of Istria has long been known for its pršut, the dry-cured ham that hangs in cellars through the long winter months, seasoned by the cold air coming off the Adriatic and the warm winds pushing down from the interior. It's a food tied to place in a way that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't stood in one of those cellars and smelled it. For a long time, though, not all the pršut sold as Istrian was actually made from Istrian pigs. The animals came from elsewhere, processed locally, cured locally, good craft but not quite the full circle. Now Istria is taking a new step toward a genuinely homegrown supply, raising the pigs on Istrian soil and carrying them through to the finished product within the region itself. It's the kind of story that might not make headlines beyond the peninsula, but it matters to the people who live there. It's about closing a gap between tradition and practice, between what a place is known for and what it actually produces from its own ground. There's a quiet pride in that, the kind that doesn't need to shout. And if you've ever sat at a long table somewhere on the Istrian coast, a thin slice of pršut laid out on a board beside some olive oil and a glass of local wine, you'll understand why getting it right, truly right, feels worth the effort. It's a small story, really. But small stories, well tended, are often the ones that hold a place together. Seychelles is a country of 115 islands scattered across the Indian Ocean, and these days it is thinking hard about what comes next. Looking toward 2026 and 2027, the government is focusing on three things at once: strengthening its financial sector, building out infrastructure, and deepening what it calls the blue economy, the careful use of ocean resources for work and for livelihoods. That last part is not abstract for a place where so much life depends on the sea. The European Union has just signed a 4-year tuna access agreement worth $26 million, which means European vessels will fish these waters under terms that bring money back to Seychelles and, in principle, keep the fishery managed rather than simply emptied. At the same time, researchers are sounding a quieter note. A recent study found that funding and research gaps could threaten the country's 2030 goals for blue carbon, the mangroves and seagrass meadows that store carbon quietly beneath the waves. It is the kind of tension small island nations know well. The ocean is both engine and inheritance, and balancing the two takes patience. There are signs of that patience on land, too. 8 families recently received new homes at Point Larue, part of a housing program called Villas Positivite, a Creole phrase that speaks to community and moving forward together. So Seychelles is building houses, agreements, ambitions, all with an eye on the water that surrounds everything. In Mali, where the land has always held more than meets the eye, gold threaded through the laterite ancient empires built on trade routes that still shimmer in the dust, the government has granted a regional exploitation permit for the Fekola mining area to the Canadian company B2 Gold. It sounds like a dry administrative act, and in one sense it is, a signature, a permit, a line on a map. But in Mali, where mining is one of the few industries that consistently reaches beyond subsistence and into the wider economy, these decisions carry real weight. The Fekola mine already operates in the Kays region, near the border with Senegal, and this new permit extends the company's reach across the surrounding area, opening the possibility of longer life for the operation and more steady work for the communities nearby. Investors noticed. B2 Gold's shares climbed sharply on the news, with some reports putting the surge above 20%. That kind of jump tells you how much uncertainty had been building. How much people were waiting for a signal that Mali's government, despite the political turbulence of recent years, would still honor its agreements and keep the sector functioning. And it is functioning. The quarter delivered well for the company, and the permit suggests that, at least in this corner of the economy, the machinery of the state is still turning. Whether that prosperity reaches deep enough into the villages and the artisanal miners who work the same earth by hand, that is always the quieter question in Mali, and one that a permit alone can't answer. But for now, the signal is one of continuity. And in this part of the world, continuity is not a small thing. Namibia has been sitting with a quiet question these days. What does it mean to belong to a country, and how do you teach that feeling to the next generation? A workshop has just concluded there, aimed at shaping what's being called the nationhood and national pride strategy, covering the years 2026 through 2031. The details of what was discussed aren't widely available, but the shape of the thing tells you something. A nation that sets aside time to ask its people what pride looks like, that's not a country in crisis, that's a country thinking ahead. Namibia is young as an independent nation, just over 3 decades now, and it carries the kind of landscape that makes you feel small in a good way. The Namib Desert stretching to the coast, the great empty spaces of the interior where cattle and wildlife still move along ancient paths. When a place like that sits down to talk about identity, it isn't only about flags and anthems. It's about what story you tell your children when you tuck them in. It's about which languages feel like home. It's about the things a country wants to carry forward and the things it would rather leave behind. The strategy won't be finished for a while yet. These conversations take time, and they should. If you're still with me, you might picture a room in Windhoek, people gathered around tables, papers and water glasses between them, talking through what makes a country feel like a country, and know that somewhere in that conversation, Namibia is listening to itself. Ethiopia has always carried a certain weight on this continent, not just because of its size or its history of independence, but because what happens there tends to ripple outward across the Horn and beyond. These days, the ripples are complicated. In the north, old alliances are shifting, and a fragile peace deal has shown cracks that worry people who remember how quickly things can unravel. There is fighting in western Tigray again, each side blaming the other, and the wounds from the earlier war have not fully closed. Further from the headlines, scholars are still trying to understand what these years have done to Ethiopian national identity itself, the question of what holds a country together when so much has been pulled apart. And yet, amid all of that, there is a quieter story worth carrying tonight. Benin, the small West African nation once known for the Kingdom of Dahomey, has been deepening its engagement with Ethiopia across multiple sectors: agriculture, trade, development. It is not a dramatic story, no summits flashing on screens, no last-minute agreements. But it points to something many Africans have been reaching toward: cooperation that grows from within the continent, solutions shaped at home rather than imported. Ambassador Dina Mufti has spoken about Ethiopia's evolving strategic landscape, and part of that landscape includes friends far away who see something worth partnering with. If you're still with me, hold that thought. Two countries, neither one wealthy, neither one at peace entirely, choosing to build something together. It is not enough, but it is not nothing either. Cyprus sits in the eastern Mediterranean, an island that has carried a line through its middle for half a century now. The division between the Greek-speaking south and the Turkish-speaking north has outlasted generations of diplomats, and for long stretches it has simply sat there, not resolved, not forgotten, just quiet. These days, that quiet is shifting. There is renewed interest in the Cyprus question, and the United Nations Secretary General has put forward an initiative aimed at kickstarting a resolution. What that means in practice is still taking shape. It is not a dramatic breakthrough, and nobody on the island is treating it as one. But there's movement where there had been stillness, and that alone is worth noticing. The UN has been part of Cyprus's story for decades: peacekeepers on the ground, good offices behind closed doors, proposals that have come close and proposals that have fallen short. People here have lived with that rhythm. They have built lives around a situation that was always meant to be temporary and somehow never was. If you're still with me, consider what it is like to wake up each morning on an island where your neighbor is right there, close enough to see, and yet separated by a line you cannot easily cross. The UN Chief's initiative is not a promise. It is more like a hand extended, again, into a space that has grown used to being left alone. Whether anyone reaches back, that is the question the island is holding, gently, in the warm air of these long evenings. Tanzania has been thinking about the shape of its future, not in years, but in generations. The country's Vision 2050 is a plan to build an economy worth $1 trillion, and the conversation now is about how you get from a document on a page to something people can actually feel in their daily lives. It's the kind of ambition that sounds abstract until you start listing what it would require: roads that hold, cities that move, schools that open on time, and a financial system that the rest of the world can trust enough to invest in. There are signs that the delivery has begun. President Samia Suluhu Hassan recently launched the second phase of Dar es Salaam's bus rapid transit project, a city of millions trying to keep moving without choking on its own traffic. Around the same time, Tanzania relaxed its foreign exchange rules, opening its government debt market to investors from around the world. It's a quiet but meaningful shift, a signal that the country wants to be part of the wider financial conversation, not just watching from the edges. None of this is simple. Growth brings its own tensions, questions about whose land is being conserved, whose development is being served, whether political openness keeps pace with economic ambition. But if you're still with me, the thing worth carrying tonight is this: Tanzania is not waiting for the future to arrive. It's trying to build it, brick by brick, and asking itself what kind of country it wants to be when it gets there. Slovenia has become the first country in the European Union to introduce fuel rationing. It's a small nation, fewer than 2.5 million people, tucked between Italy, Austria, Hungary, and Croatia, a place better known for its alpine lakes and limestone caves than for making headlines of this kind. But energy supplies across the wider region have been disrupted, and the government in Ljubljana has decided it would rather act early than wait. The details of the rationing are still taking shape, but the significance is clear. No other EU member has yet taken this step, which means Slovenia is, in some sense, testing the water for everyone else. For a country that sits at a crossroads of European trade, where trucks and cars move constantly between north and south, limiting fuel is not a small thing. It touches commuters, farmers, small businesses, and the steady flow of visitors who have been returning to Slovenia's mountains and coast in growing numbers. There's something quietly sober about a government choosing restraint before crisis forces it, a willingness to go first, to absorb the discomfort, so that the situation doesn't get worse later. If you're still with me, you might picture a Slovenian petrol station at dusk, the pumps still lit, the rules quietly posted, and people reading them, adjusting their plans, getting on with their evenings. It's not panic, it's care, expressed as caution. And in a Europe watching its energy supplies with growing concern, it may not be the last story of this kind we hear. Algeria has done something its women's football team had never done before. At the Women's Africa Cup of Nations, they fought back to beat Ivory Coast 2-1, and in doing so earned a place at their first ever Women's World Cup. It wasn't a straightforward match. Ivory Coast pushed hard, and the game turned on mistakes and a red card that shifted the balance. But Algeria kept their nerve, came from behind, and finished the job. They also reached the WAFCON semifinals for the first time, a historic milestone on its own, even before the World Cup berth was confirmed. Among those celebrating is Belumu, a player who also features for West Ham United in England, bringing club experience into the national side at exactly the right moment. Morocco joined Algeria in the semi-finals, which means two North African neighbors are now standing tall in a tournament that has long been dominated by sides from further south on the continent. For Algeria's women, this is more than a result on a pitch. It is a first, the kind of first that changes what young players back home believe is possible, and what families and clubs begin to invest in. The World Cup still lies ahead, and there are tougher matches to come. But these days, if you're in Algiers or Oran or any of the towns in between, there is a particular kind of pride in the air. Quiet, maybe, but unmistakable. A door has opened, and Algeria walked through it together. Russia sits at the center of an anxious conversation this week, one that stretches from the Black Sea to the halls of NATO. The Wall Street Journal has reported that Western officials believe Russia could be positioned to take action against a NATO member as early as next month. The reporting is thin on specifics, and nothing is certain. But the worry itself has weight, and it has settled over relations between Moscow and the alliance like a held breath. Meanwhile, the war grinds on in ways that feel anything but abstract. Russian strikes near Kyiv have killed 4 people, among them a child. Those numbers are small and enormous at the same time, and the loss of a child in a nighttime attack is the kind of fact that doesn't need amplification to be felt. Turkey, watching from across the Black Sea, has called for a moratorium on attacks there by both Russia and Ukraine, a quiet diplomatic gesture aimed at keeping the water from boiling over. And advocates for a former United States Marine held in Russia for years say his health has deteriorated to the point of near death, a human life suspended in the machinery of geopolitics. If you're still with me, you might notice how each of these threads pulls at the same cloth. A country at war, a region on edge, and lives caught in between. Nothing tonight is resolved, but the world is watching, and watching carefully. In the Marshall Islands, the ocean is never just scenery. It's where people live, fish, and carry memory. These days, a quiet argument is being made from there, and it's a simple one. Before the world faces its next nuclear crisis, it should listen to the people who already lived through one. Between the 1940s and the 1950s, the United States conducted dozens of nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands, on atolls whose names Bikini and Nuatak became shorthand for destruction the world barely understood at the time. Whole communities were moved from their ancestral islands. Some were exposed to fallout they couldn't see or name. The article making its way around now doesn't dwell on the numbers. It asks something harder. It asks whether anyone is still listening. Survivors and their descendants have spent decades telling their stories to commissions, to journalists, to anyone who would sit still long enough. And the fear is that as the generation that felt the ash on their skin passes on, the urgency fades with them. The piece is not angry, it's tired. The way people get when they've said something many times and watched the room move on, but there's still a steadiness to it. A belief that testimony properly heard still means something. If you're still with me, that's really the whole of it. A small nation asking the world to remember not the weapons, but the people who were underneath them when the sky changed. In Botswana, the waterholes never really belong to anyone. They belong to whoever arrives first and whoever is willing to hold their ground. This week, a pride of lions came down to drink, the way they do, unhurried, expecting the quiet. But a hippo was already there. And hippos, as anyone who has spent time near Botswana's waterways will tell you, do not step aside. What happened next is the kind of encounter that reminds you how little separates the everyday from the extraordinary out there. The lions and the hippo faced each other across the shallows, each one reading the other, each one deciding. It's a negotiation that happens all the time in these places, mostly out of sight, and usually without anyone getting hurt. Not far from that same kind of water, a boat full of tourists found themselves closer to a hippo than anyone would choose. The animal charged, and the boat pulled away, and the footage traveled fast across the world. But the heart of it is simpler than the headlines. A hippo was protecting its stretch of water, the way it always has. The lions were looking for a drink, the tourists were looking for a glimpse of something wild, and everyone in the end went home, out on Botswana's waterways. That's the arrangement. You keep your distance, you show respect, and the wild goes on being wild, one waterhole at a time. Guinea has always been a country that sits on extraordinary ground. The red earth here holds some of the largest bauxite reserves on the planet. The ore that becomes aluminum, that becomes cans and window frames and aircraft skins, the lightweight bones of the modern world. And these days, Guinea has made a decision about who will buy that ore from its state-owned mining company. The choice is Glencore, one of the biggest mining and trading firms anywhere, a Swiss-based giant with operations scattered across continents. Under this arrangement, Glencore becomes the off-taker, meaning the company that purchases and markets the bauxite pulled from Guinea's soil. It's a significant vote of confidence in one direction, and it gives a single corporate partner exclusive rights to a mineral that has shaped this country's economy for generations. For a nation where bauxite is the backbone of export earnings, that kind of arrangement carries real weight. There are always questions when a country places its most precious resource in the hands of one buyer, questions about leverage, about pricing, about who holds the balance when negotiations come around again. But there's also something straightforward in it. Guinea knows what it has. The world knows what it needs, and in the quiet hum of ports and rail lines and loading terminals along the Atlantic coast, that ancient red earth makes its way outward toward foundries and factories far from home. If you're still with me, we'll carry on from here. South Korea has been weathering a spell of turbulence in its stock markets these past weeks, the kind that comes when borrowed money meets sudden doubt. Volatility spiked, and for a while the rhythm of trading in Seoul felt unsteady, but the sharpest edges are beginning to wear down. Leveraged positions, those bets built on borrowed funds, have been unwinding. Quietly, steadily, the way a tide pulls back from a shore it rushed up onto. Traders call it getting flushed out. It sounds abrupt, but what it really means is that the excess is leaving the system, and what remains is closer to solid ground. South Korea's markets are among the most dynamic in Asia, wired deep into the global supply chains that build semiconductors, batteries, and screens the world runs on. When they shake, people far beyond Seoul feel the vibration. So the easing matters not just to investors, but to anyone watching how confidence moves through an economy that practically never sleeps. There's no triumph in it, and no disaster averted so much as pressure releasing through the valves it was always going to find. If you're still with me, you might think of it as a city after a storm. The streets still wet, the air heavy, but the worst already past. The lights in the towers along the Han River are steady again. People are going back to work in the morning, and the numbers on the screens are behaving more like numbers, less like weather. Monaco is the second smallest country in the world, and yet once a year it becomes the center of the motor racing universe. The Monaco Grand Prix winds through the streets of Monte Carlo, past the harbor and the casino and the old hillside neighborhoods, and it has been doing so for the better part of a century. What makes it special is not speed, not really. It is the tightness of it all. The circuit is narrow, the corners unforgiving, the barriers close enough to touch. Drivers call it a race that feels like trying to ride a bicycle through your living room. There is almost no margin for error, and so the race becomes less about raw power and more about precision, nerve, and patience. The cars look almost too large for the roads they are using, because in ordinary life those roads are just that. Roads carrying residents and delivery vans and tourists who have no idea they are tracing the path of legends. On race weekend, the whole principality seems to hold its breath. Balconies become grandstands. Yachts in the harbor become floating suites, and when it is over, the barriers come down, the roads reopen, and Monaco returns to being what it is, quietly. Every other day, a small place by the sea, with its own rhythms, its own light, and a memory of engines still faintly in the air. Nicaragua, these days, is a country where the space for disagreement keeps narrowing. The government of Daniel Ortega has been moving to eliminate the political opposition, not by debate, but by banning it, by legal maneuver, by steadily closing the door. Election bans have drawn concern from voices across the region, with observers arguing that what's happening deserves a collective response from neighboring democracies. The word dictatorship has surfaced in Nicaraguan commentary, a word some writers there note carries its own weight and its own lessons when spoken aloud. The Catholic Church, too, has faced what many are calling alarming persecution, a significant turn in a country where the church has long been woven into public life. And the legislative process itself, according to Nicaraguan reporting, has become something people describe as arbitrary laws passed, not through deliberation, but through a machinery that answers to one direction. If you're still with me, it's worth sitting with what this means for ordinary Nicaraguans, people who wake up each morning in places like Macualizo and Nueva Segovia, where the air quality is tracked and the days unfold with their own quiet rhythms, even as the political ground beneath them hardens. There was a moment of brightness, though, that many held on to: a baseball team that fought its way to the gold medal match against Panama at the Central American and Caribbean Games in Santo Domingo, pushing the game into extra innings before Panama claimed the title. A small country, playing with heart, on a field where the rules were fair. That image lingers even as the larger story remains unsettled, and the night settles over Managua and the hills beyond. Moldova sits between Romania and Ukraine, a small country whose choices ripple outward in ways its size wouldn't suggest. These days, it is quietly building bridges, not dramatic ones, but the kind that hold up under weight. Bulgaria and Moldova have been deepening their cooperation, particularly in energy and in Moldova's long walk toward European Union membership. It's practical work. Energy security has been a real concern here, and Moldova has been taking measures to prevent power shortages, strengthening its position before winter tests the grid again. Bulgaria itself, an EU member with experience navigating energy transitions, is a natural partner, two countries looking at similar questions about where their power comes from and how to make it reliable. The broader context matters too. A Latvian official named Kalnina Lukaševica put it plainly recently. Moldova's progress toward the EU matters for the security of all of Europe. That's not a small thing to say about a country of roughly 2.5 million people, but it's true. Every step Moldova takes toward Brussels shifts the map a little. And meanwhile, life goes on in the orchards. This year's apple harvest is expected to grow by over 17%, even as orchards across the EU face a decline. There's something steady in that, trees doing what trees do, while governments negotiate and grids get reinforced. If you're still with me, hold that image for a moment. Apples ripening in Moldovan sunlight, and somewhere in a government office, two countries signing papers about electricity, both real, both part of the same quiet story. Papua New Guinea has reached a quiet but significant turning point in a long national conversation. The country has completed a constitutional consultation process and is now preparing to hold a vote tied to Bougainville, the autonomous region to the northeast whose people have been walking a patient road toward deciding their own political future. It is the kind of story that does not announce itself loudly. There are no crowds in the street for a constitutional consultation, no single dramatic moment. Instead, there are officials meeting across tables, legal texts being reviewed line by line, and communities waiting to see what shape the next chapter will take. Bougainville's relationship with the rest of Papua New Guinea has never been simple. A decade of conflict in the late 20th century left deep marks, and the peace that followed was built slowly through negotiation and trust rather than victory. A referendum several years ago showed a clear preference for independence, but a preference is not yet a border, and a vote is not yet a nation. What is happening now is the careful, unglamorous work of turning an expressed wish into a constitutional reality. For people in Bougainville and for people across Papua New Guinea watching from the mainland, this is a story about what self-determination looks like when it is done patiently, through law and dialogue. The vote ahead will be another step, not a final one. And in a region where the maps have been redrawn before, that step carries the weight of history and the quiet hope of something lasting. In Liberia, a quiet change has come for families with young children. The country has ended registration fees for primary schools. It sounds small on paper, a line in a policy, a number removed from a form. But for parents across Monrovia and the counties beyond, it is the difference between sending a child to school and keeping them home. For years, those fees sat at the front gate of learning. Not tuition, not books, not uniforms, just the cost of enrolling, of having your child's name written down. And for families living harvest to harvest or selling in the market day by day, that cost was enough to shut the door. Liberia knows something about doors that stay shut. The country has spent decades rebuilding after civil war, and education has been part of that slow, patient work, training teachers, repairing classrooms, trying to make sure the next generation carries more than the last one did. Removing a fee does not fix everything. It does not build a roof or fill a desk or train a teacher who never had the chance to finish their own schooling. But it does one thing clearly. It says that the first step should not cost a family anything. If you're still with me, think of a mother walking her daughter to a school gate this term and finding it open in a way it was not before. Somewhere in Liberia that is happening, not loudly, just happening. And the year ahead will tell what those children make of it. In Cuba these days, the lights go out and stay out. Blackouts stretch for days at a time, and life rearranges itself around small bursts of electricity. A few hours here, an hour there, enough to charge a phone or run a fan before the dark settles back in. The cause is simple and stubborn. Cuba is low on oil. Fuel supplies have dwindled under the weight of long-standing US sanctions, and the island's grid simply can't keep up. People wait, they cook what they can, when they can. They sit outside where the air moves. Now Cuba is looking up. The country is turning to solar power, and it's doing so with help from China. It's an energy pivot born not of ambition, but of necessity. A country that has spent generations dependent on imported fuel trying to find something steadier in the sun above its own rooftops. The details are still emerging, but the direction is clear. Panels where there were none, and a slow reach towards something less fragile. None of this happens in a vacuum. U.S. pressure on Cuba has tightened in recent years, touching not just fuel but food supplies too. Young people on the island have spoken openly about the toll, the hunger, the waiting, the feeling of being squeezed from every direction. And still, somewhere in the middle of all that, there are people looking at the sky and thinking about light. If you're still with me, hold that thought. Cuba is reaching for something, and the sun, at least, doesn't answer to anyone. The Bahamas sits in the Atlantic just southeast of Florida, a scatter of islands and cays that somewhere around 5 million cruise passengers step onto each year. It is one of the most visited corners of the Caribbean, and for most travelers the arrival is easy, warm, familiar. But a new advisory has been circulating, aimed specifically at people coming by cruise ship, and it is worth knowing about before you go. The details of the warning are still making their way through travel outlets, so I won't try to fill in what isn't yet clear. What matters is that anyone planning a stop in Nassau or the outer islands should check the latest guidance from their cruise line and from Bahamian authorities before they travel. Not because the islands have become unwelcoming, they haven't. But because the difference between a good trip and a difficult one often comes down to small preparations. A moment spent reading before you walk down the gangplank. The Bahamas has been navigating a busy season. College basketball teams have been visiting, traveling there for summer tournaments. Fishermen and boaters continue to work the waters between the islands, as they always have, and alongside the visitors, daily life goes on for the people who call these islands home. If you're still with me, hold this thought. The sea is the same sea whether you arrive on a ship or grew up beside it. A little care, a little attention, and the place gives back what it always has. Warmth, light, and the sound of water on sand. Bulgaria has been keeping a careful watch on its skies these days, and for good reason. Not long ago, an unknown drone exploded in Bulgarian airspace, not far from the Romanian border and close to a natural gas pipeline. No one was hurt, nothing was damaged. But the quiet of that explosion, the fact that something could arrive and detonate without warning, has stayed with people. Bulgaria's defense ministry has now said the drone was most likely a Maya-type drone, the kind used by Ukraine. Kyiv has denied targeting Bulgaria and promised a full inquiry. The suggestion is that the drone drifted off course, carried by wind or malfunction, rather than aimed with intent. Still, the incident has rippled outward. Similar drones have been spotted in Germany. And together, those sightings have raised quiet concerns about how far the war's reach extends, not through deliberate strikes, but through the way conflict scatters debris across borders that once felt safe. For Bulgaria, a NATO member on the Black Sea, this is the kind of moment that asks a country to hold steady. The pipeline nearby was untouched. The sky is quiet again, but the fact that a small, unmanned aircraft could cross into Bulgarian territory and explode before anyone could identify it, that lingers. It is a reminder that war, even when it belongs to someone else, has a way of sending fragments into places that never asked for them. Guatemala has seen a quiet homecoming this week. Indigenous leaders who had been held in prison for 15 months have been released after they were detained during protests in 2023. The protests were part of a larger movement that swept through the country that year, as Guatemalans took to the streets to defend democratic institutions they believed were under threat. Indigenous communities were at the heart of that movement, organized, visible, and determined. For that determination, some of their leaders were jailed. 15 months is a long time to sit in a cell. It is long enough for seasons to change, for families to mark birthdays and holidays without you, for the world outside to move on while you wait. We do not know the details of their release or what the court said or what comes next for them legally. What we know is that they walked out. In Guatemala, indigenous communities carry a particular weight in the country's civic life. They have organized through ancestral authority, through community councils, through centuries of presence on the land. When they protest, it is not a fringe voice. It is the country speaking from its roots. The 2023 protests were about more than one political moment. They were about whether the country's institutions would answer to its people. These leaders spent more than a year behind bars for standing in that question. Now they are out. If you are still with me, hold that thought, not as a resolution, because the story is not over, but as a breath, a door opening after a long time closed. Myanmar has done something it hasn't done in a long while. The military government there has released the first verified images of Aung San Suu Kyi since she was detained years ago now, in the upheaval that brought the generals back to full power. The photographs show her older, visibly aged but present, and their release seems calculated. The junta, which has spent these years isolated and criticized by much of the world, appears to be signaling a willingness to re-engage, to ease its way back towards something resembling normal diplomatic life. There was a visit by the junta chief to Bangkok recently, and it drew online criticism from Myanmar's own people, many of whom saw it as an attempt at legitimacy by a leadership they do not recognize. Meanwhile, far from Myanmar's borders, protections that had allowed some Myanmar nationals to remain in the United States are being lifted as courts clear the way for deportations, a reminder that the ripples of Myanmar's crisis have reached distant shores, and that the people caught up in them face their own uncertain nights. And on a football pitch in Southeast Asia, Myanmar's national team lost to Thailand in the ASEAN Cup, 2-0. A small thing perhaps, but the kind of ordinary national moment that continues even when everything else feels stalled. What lingers, though, is that photograph. A woman who once stood at the center of her country's hopes, seen again, and a government choosing this moment to let her be seen. What it means and where it leads is not yet clear, but the image is out now, and the world is looking. Mauritania sits on the western edge of the Arab world, where the Sahara meets the Atlantic, and these days its attention is turning quietly toward the classroom. The country's High Council for Education has signed a memorandum of understanding with ALEXO, the Arab League's educational, cultural, and scientific organization. It's the kind of agreement that doesn't make much noise. No crowds, no ceremonies broadcast across the region, just a document, some signatures, and a shared intention to think more carefully about how young people learn. If you're still with me, you might wonder what ALEXO actually does. Think of it as a partner organization that works across Arab League countries on everything from literacy to heritage preservation. For Mauritania, a nation where desert covers most of the land and where schools in remote communities face challenges that city classrooms rarely imagine, having a regional partner willing to share expertise is not a small thing. The details of the agreement aren't widely available yet. What we know is that both sides have put their names to a commitment. Education matters, and it matters enough to formalize the conversation. In a country where more than half the population is under 25, that conversation has a long road ahead of it. So tonight, from Nouakchott, the capital that rises from the dunes along the coast, the story is a quiet one, a memorandum, a handshake between institutions, and somewhere out there, perhaps, a classroom that will feel the difference in ways no headline will ever capture. India finds itself watching a familiar kind of tension these days, one that sits between its own energy needs and the long reach of Washington's trade policy. There is talk in the United States Senate of steep tariffs, potentially as high as 100%, on countries that continue buying oil from Russia. India is one of those countries. For Delhi, Russian oil has been a practical matter, not an ideological one. It keeps fuel affordable for more than 1 billion people, and it keeps the economy steady when global prices swing. So the prospect of a tariff wall going up between India and the American market is being watched carefully, and with some wariness. At the same time, the channels of diplomacy haven't gone quiet. Vice President Vance and Prime Minister Modi have spoken by phone, discussing ways to deepen the ties between their two countries, which, depending on how you look at it, makes the tariff question feel less like a rupture and more like a difficult passage in a relationship that both sides still want to hold together. India has been here before, navigating between powers that pull in different directions. It tends to move carefully, weighing costs, reading the room, and holding its position without rushing toward a confrontation. If you're still with me, what's worth carrying tonight is not the headline of a tariff number, but the quieter image of a country standing at a crossroads, energy on one side, trade on the other, and choosing, as it so often does, to think before it steps. In Nigeria, 1,500 couples gathered for a mass wedding, a ceremony arranged with the help of the state, meant to ease the cost of marriage for families who couldn't easily afford it on their own. Among them was a man who had once lost everything. His wife and 6 children were killed in an attack years ago. He had been left alone with that grief, carrying it through the kind of silence that follows unbearable loss. And now, in a crowd of thousands, he stood again beside a new partner, ready to begin a life he may not have imagined was still possible for him. The mass wedding drew couples from across the region. Some were young, starting out. Others were older, finding companionship after years on their own. The state had organized the event to help with the expenses, the gowns, the gifts, the traditional obligations that can make marriage a heavy financial burden. For most who took part, it was a practical kindness. For one man, it was something more. You think about what it takes to stand in a celebration after losing the people you celebrated with? You think about the courage that must require, or perhaps just the slow, stubborn refusal to let one story be the whole story. If you're still with me, hold that image for a moment. A man in a crowd of brides and grooms, choosing to try again. The music plays, the couples are blessed, and somewhere in that vast hall, a life quietly restarts. And that's the world for tonight. Wherever you are, whatever tomorrow holds, rest easy. The world will keep turning slowly while you sleep, and we'll take another quiet trip around it tomorrow night. Good night.